From the Department of Sociology here at University of Arizona today, and he's going to be talking to us about decomposing the emergence and transmission of multi-generational educational inequality, which kind of boils down to what effect do grandparents have on kids' education, right? So it should be really interesting, really thinking about what that means, how grandparents may or may not have an effect on children's outcomes and specifically on education. Jeremy also does a lot of work on school segregation. If you can just forward that for me to the next one. Just a friendly reminder for you guys about Frances McClellan. Just to remember her legacy. We always have her candies here. And she herself was a wonderful role model for resilience and an advocate for research. So we're always happy to carry her name through the Frances McClellan Institute for Children, Youth, and Families. And one thing I do want to mention to you all is one thing that we're going to be doing next week is Project Semilla. And so Felice will be sending this out to you. And so this is going to be, I think, pretty much all week, right? All week from 11:30 to 2:30. And you can come down to the Frances McClellan Institute in room 215, and we're going to have materials so you can make a bookmark, and we're going to share those bookmarks with local students in high schools and elementary schools. And it's all about supporting them around any issues related to race-related bullying and intimidation. And this is growth. This idea came from a dear friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Lisa Edwards, who's at Marquette University, who started doing it there, and they felt that it was really exciting to, even just on campus, for people to kind of gather at this moment in time when we're hearing a lot of messages about bullying and race-related issues that are happening, particularly to our young people in school, and really putting out a positive message of hope and resilience. And for us, also a great opportunity to connect with our local partners in TUSD and some of our other nonprofit agencies. So I hope you can come by, make a bookmark, and then we're going to distribute them. The idea too is for the high school and elementary to make some bookmarks that will come back to our students here at U of A. So if you have a chance, you can forward it to the next one. And always want to remember and thank Pamela Turbeville for supporting this speaker series, because she provides you the cookies and any other support for national speakers that we bring in. So we're always grateful for her support. And she's one of our really outstanding FCS alumni. And just, I think I already said this, but if you can forward it one more. This is Dr. Field's email address. If you have any questions for him after the talk, you can always follow up with him. Again, he's right here on campus. His background was his PhD in sociology from University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we were just talking about how lovely this winter day in Tucson is and how we really appreciate our weather here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him.
All right, thank you. Okay, so this is actually the first time I'm presenting this paper, so I'm really glad to have the opportunity to get some feedback. I think that'll help me with framing, with unanticipated questions and things like that. Also, I used to be a high school teacher, so after about 10 minutes of me talking, I'll start to panic and assume people are going to quit listening. So you're welcome to interrupt me at any time with questions or ask me to slow down. And then I can also take questions at the end as well, obviously. So the title of this, The Emergence and Transmission of Multi-Generational Educational Inequality. So over the past 5 years, there's been a rapid increase in multi-generational stratification research. Rob Mayer, who's a stratification researcher in sociology, gave a Population Association of America address where he called for a lot more research and attention to the way not only your parents and your parents' family background affects your educational and socioeconomic attainment, but the way your grandparents and more distant ancestors might affect your life chances. So the big question here is whether a two-generation approach, parent-child approach to stratification is adequate to understand processes of social reproduction and mobility, or whether the social origins relevant to one's attainment have deeper roots. So let's try this out. You can think of these as measures of attainment in the grandparent, parent, and child generation. I'm using E because I'm focused on educational attainment today. And so the question is, the way we usually have thought about intergenerational inequality is parents affect their children's outcomes. So we would expect some relationship between grandparents and child attainment, but it would be explained by this two-step process. The multi-generational question is whether there's also a direct influence that's not explained by grandparents' influence on parents. So another way of thinking about this is how much do the status, resources, and attributes of grandparents or more distant ancestors matter for one's life chances, and how do they matter? So like I said, most of this new multi-generational stratification research is focused on this direct influence because it's testing whether the traditional two-generation approach is adequate. So the question here is there a multi-generational relationship even after we've accounted for the influence that grandparents' attainment has on the parent generation? So to summarize the prior work, which is kind of scant at this time, it suggests that there may be some direct influence of grandparents on children's attainment, but it's relatively small. So if you just look at the relationship between grandparents and child's attainment, there is a large relationship, but most of it operates through the influence that grandparents have on parents and then parents have on children. I will say, however, that the findings do vary quite a bit. So there's findings from different countries that differ. They differ depending on what outcome you're analyzing, so education, social class, income, occupational status, things like that. There's also variation by the methods used and the variables that are used in the analyses. So there's a lot more room for more research on disentangling these processes. The problems in this literature, one of them is that, one that I think is a problem, is that it does focus overwhelmingly on these direct effects. And so it has paid less attention to what are the most important mechanisms of the indirect effects, because we do know that there are big indirect effects of grandparents on children through parents. The other big problem is the evidence that does exist for direct effects relies on residual or unexplained inequality, or an unexplained association between grandparents and children's outcomes. And that's a really problematic way to test theories, right? So this is common in studies of discrimination. You control for things, there's some unexplained gap, and we could attribute that to discrimination, but we could attribute it to anything else that we didn't measure as well. So the problem is the more poorly that we control for all of these mediating factors, the more likely we are to misattribute them to direct multi-generational effects. So in this study, I'm trying to make two main contributions. The first is to better explicate the intervening mechanisms of the indirect effects based on the theory that does exist. These are just the types of mechanisms we think about for intergenerational inequality in general. So the transmission of material resources, human capital or skills, and then culture, values, family environment, things like that. The second contribution is, we call this a direct effect, but it has to have some mediating process as well. There has to be some way that grandparents are directly affecting children's outcomes. So I'm going to test for this direct effect by testing measurable variables that might explain why grandparents affect children beyond their influence on parents. And so the two general ways in which the literature has discussed this is, first, grandparents can have a direct effect on kids' socio-emotional development. The more involved they are in child rearing, the more likely they are to influence the development of kids' cognitive and non-cognitive skills. But grandparents could also directly transmit material resources or values. They might be like stewards of family values that could influence kids directly as well. So I'm going from this pretty simple diagram to a more complicated one. But basically what I've done here is I've added some intervening constructs. These are the constructs that are supposed to explain why grandparents' attainment affects parents, and parents affects children. And I'm also going to account for some preceding variables that might influence this whole process. So we have education measured in all 3 generations. This is educational attainment. I'll talk about specific measures in a second. The mediators, the family background or environment or upbringing, and this is when parents were young. This is when children were young. Cognitive and non-cognitive skills of parents and children when they're older children or adolescents. And then their educational orientations, so educational aspirations and expectations. These antecedent variables, you might think of as like confounders. These are things that are distinct from grandparents' SES, and they precede it. So they might influence parents' attainment, and there might be like persistent inequality, for example, related to racial inequality. So I'm going to account for some of those types of variables as well. So this looks pretty complicated, but it looks complicated because I'm trying not to make assumptions that might not be true. So really the key features of this conceptual model are that I'm allowing grandparents' education to be directly linked to any of these variables that might be mediators or mechanisms. And I'm also allowing any of these mediators or explanations to have a direct influence on kids' outcomes. My analyses will allow any of these things to affect anything that comes later in the sequence. So basically, this is just to avoid assuming that there aren't these types of effects if they do exist. So it's trying to be flexible. So the data for this come from, I need 3 generations. I need data on grandparents, parents, and children. The data for parents and grandparents come from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, 1979. So this was a sample of over 12,000 adolescents and young adults, 1979. Of that sample, 4,900 roughly were women who went on to have children. Those are going to be the parents in this study. This survey also collected information on this cohort's parents. So it's kind of retrospective data on the maternal grandparents. And then they followed all the children of these women in the National Longitudinal Survey child and young adult cohorts. And they followed them through birth up through 2014 is included in this study. There's roughly 11,500 children. So those are the 3 generations. It is maternal grandparents. I don't have information on paternal grandparents. So this is kind of a one-sided view of multi-generational inequality. But most people do expect that the maternal grandparent link will be stronger than paternal grandparents just because mothers are more involved in child rearing in both generations. And research on grandparents shows that maternal grandparents are more involved than paternal grandparents. Okay, so when I use the term multi-generational inequality or multi-generational effects, what I specifically mean here is average differences in children's educational attainment across levels of grandparents' education. And I have 3 categories of grandparents' education. I take the highest completed grade of either maternal grandparent, and I have 3 categories. So the lowest, less than 12th grade, the middle group, 12th to 15th, so roughly high school or some college education. And then the highest group has at least 16, so roughly a bachelor's degree in college. So those are the 3 grandparent education groups. The child outcomes, the primary outcome I'll focus on is the highest grade completed, so just number of, it's like a continuous measure. I also have results for whether they complete a high school diploma, whether they attend college, and whether they earn a bachelor's degree. Okay, so I'll show you the variables that I include for each of these constructs. My analysis isn't really going to focus on specific variables. It's more focusing on the constructs as a whole. But for these antecedents, I want to control for race. I use the race of the mother, but it's extremely highly correlated with the grandparents and the children. The nativity of the mother and the maternal grandparents, the home language during the mother's upbringing, and the region and urbanicity in which the mother was raised. So those are things that might have some relation to grandparents' education that isn't really related to SES, and you might want to distinguish from this process. Family upbringing of the mother. So this is the construct that I think I'm probably measuring most poorly in this study. There aren't a lot of great variables for this. I have the home reading environment. This is a scale of 3 items about reading materials in the home when the mothers were 14. A measure of whether they were in a 2-parent biological family throughout ages 0 to 18, and the number of siblings. So since this is probably pretty poorly measured, when I start accounting for how much this contributes to the process, I'm probably going to underestimate how much this accounts for multi-generational inequality, and it might lead me to overestimate some of the subsequent factors like parent skills or education orientations.
A question.
Yeah.
I don't see on that list experience of trauma. I'm wondering if that's something that was measured at all, or maybe just was absent from the data you had to use.
For parents, I'm pretty sure it would not have been measured. For the children, I could probably go back in, and they have a ton of measures about things that have happened in the home, about health problems, psychological distress, and things like that, that I haven't included those specific measures. I've used kind of aggregate scales. But yeah, I haven't focused or differentiated any sort of measure that would isolate trauma. Okay, so for the child's generation, I have more of the types of measures you would want. The first thing I'm going to, and some of my analyses separate this out, but how much do differences in grandparent co-residence explain? I just have a measure of whether the child lived with, had a grandparent living with them in the home when they were growing up. I have separate scales for cognitive stimulation and emotional support. These are averaged across ages 0 to 14. This is from the home inventory. I have the mother's age at birth, the number of siblings, 3-category measure of family structure, so whether there was always a 2-parent biological family, whether that was disrupted, or whether it was never a 2-parent biological family. And most of that is single mothers, but not all of it. And then I have measures of average family income and average net worth, which is wealth, basically, throughout the years in which the child was ages 0 to 18. Okay, the skill measures. I want measures of both cognitive and non-cognitive skills, behavioral skills. For the parents, I have the Armed Forces Qualifying Test. This is usually discussed as a measure of general cognitive or academic skills. I have their percentile score. I have a scale of delinquent behaviors and drug use. This is 17 items. I do have a slide with details on scale construction, but I won't go into the details unless you'd like to see that. There's also a scale of locus of control. And these are all collected when the mothers were adolescents or very young adults. The child generation, I have another measure. I'm calling it intellectual skills. It's a scale based on 4 achievement tests. So they're highly correlated. This is like general academic skills or cognitive skills. I have a scale of behavior problems at ages 9 to 14. This is from 6 subscales of the behavior problems inventory. This was reported by mothers. These are also really highly correlated. So it's general behavior problems, probably at home. A measure of self-perceived scholastic ability, ages 9 to 14. And then I have separate scales for delinquency and drug use from child self-reports as well. Okay, the last constructs, mediating constructs are educational orientations. For the mother, I have educational aspirations and expectations. When they were 14 to 21, measured as the highest grade they expected or aspired to. And for children, I have their own aspirations and expectations at ages 15 to 18, and also I have the parents' expectations for the child when they were 9 to 14. I haven't talked about parents' education yet. So I have measures of attainment for the mother and the father, and I also include an average measure of all of the maternal aunts and uncles. There's been some research that shows influences of extended families' education on children's education beyond that of parents. So I include those for this generation measure here as well. Okay, there are some missing data. I use multiple imputation. I'm happy to provide more details on that if people are interested, but I use the full sample of data after I've imputed missing values. So the 3 questions I'm going to focus on. First, just how large are the net or overall multi-generational effects, so the gaps in attainment by grandparents' education. And then are there any direct effects that are not accounted for by grandparents' earlier influences on parents? And then what are the most consequential sources of the indirect effects? There's 2 analytic approaches. The first is not very creatively named. This is a forward sequential decomposition. And it's forward because I'm going from left to right in the conceptual model, and I'm just going to account for each construct in order, see how much inequality it explains. So these give a specific type of effect or explanation. This is the forward sequence gives us what I'm going to call net total effects. So net of the influence of constructs in prior steps, how much multi-generational inequality is explained by the total effect of that construct on the kids' outcomes. And this kind of shows the steps. So you can think about this as I'm kind of breaking these arrows in the model one at a time and seeing how much each step eliminates the multi-generational inequality. So there's 8 steps, antecedents first, and then parents, family upbringing, skills, orientation, education, etc. Anything that's left over, we might attribute to a direct effect, but I'll come back to that in a second. So each step is going to eliminate disparities by levels of grandparents' education in that construct that weren't already explained in prior steps. So for example, in step 3, I'm going to eliminate the disparities in parent skills across these grandparent education groups that weren't already explained by disparities in family background or race, nativity, etc. Okay, so one thing I'll come back to in a second, the intuitive way to understand this is just telling us where multi-generational educational inequality first emerges in this process. The second approach is going to isolate the factors through which it ultimately operates. So I just do a reverse sequence analysis in this case. And I call these conditional direct effects because it's referring to once we hold the prior stuff constant, how much multi-generational inequality operates through the direct effect of any particular construct on children's attainment. So you can think about this as breaking these arrows one at a time and seeing how much of the total inequality each step explains. Okay, so again, the first approach is just going to isolate where multi-generational inequality first emerges. And the second one is going to tell us what factors does it ultimately operate through. In both approaches, I'll end up with the same amount of unexplained inequality, and that could be, but may not be, indicative of direct grandparent effects. So going back to the direct effects, I want to assess whether the constructs in the child's generation have net total effects from that first sequence I showed you. So in other words, how much multi-generational inequality operates through a direct link from grandparents' education to through the effects of children's upbringing and their skills and their educational orientations. So basically, I want to find how much do these pathways explain of multi-generational inequality. So going back to the theories of how grandparents could directly affect children's education, if it's socio-emotional, they affect their socio-emotional development, we would expect it to show up in the measures of intellectual skills, behavioral problems, perceived ability, things like that. If it's related to family values or the transmission of wealth, we would expect it to show up in their family upbringing or their educational aspirations. So these effects should explain at least some of the direct influence that grandparents' education has on kids' education. If not, it makes it really implausible to attribute whatever's unexplained to grandparents. Because if there is a direct effect and it's not operating through these types of variables, then what is it operating through? So if you have ideas when I get to the end, that would be helpful because I'm at a loss. Okay. Another more minor contribution of this paper is in this literature, people have been critical of using regression methods because two reasons. They're linear models and they might omit important interactions. So for example, parents' education, how much that affects kids' education might depend on the level of the grandparents' education. And there is some evidence that that's the case. And it gets complicated to incorporate all those sort of complex things into a regression equation. The other thing is when we do a regression, we find there's some association between grandparents and kids' outcomes, and then we control for parents' outcomes. This creates what some of the methodologists in this literature have called endogeneity bias. So one way of thinking about this, I control for parents' education. I'm now looking at the link between grandparents and child's outcomes for people with the same level of parents' education. But if you're comparing somebody who, let's say we have parents who got a college degree, if we're comparing those whose grandparents had a college degree to those who were the grandparents were high school dropouts, there's something about those people whose grandparents were dropouts but earned a college degree that's exceptional about them, right? So there's these unobserved things that are going to become correlated with grandparents' education when you do a regression like that. So the solution, I'm going to compare the results using regression to a different method that instead of controlling for the variables in a regression, just balances those variables across groups. So in other words, it creates groups of grandparents' education that have the same average of distribution of parents' education or whatever the mediator is. And I do that through reweighting. And I'm happy to share this paper if people want more of the details, but I don't want to spend too much time on it in the talk. But the advantages of this are, with this reweighting approach, you don't have to make any functional form assumptions like you would in a regression. And we're not looking at these multi-generational associations within levels of these variables anymore. So we don't have that problem with unobservable variables and endogeneity bias. I think I'll skip over some of these method slides. One way to understand the reweighting, there's two things you might be familiar with that help explain how the reweighting works. The first one is if you've seen propensity score analyses to adjust for control variables. They balance the distribution of control variables. You can use weighting. So basically, there's a treatment group and a control group. Based on the control variables, you find the probability of being in the treatment group. And then you can create inverse probability weights. When you use those weights, you have a treatment and control group with the same distribution of control variables. Also, there's a similarity to survey weighting. Not everyone in a survey, there's like sample weights because certain groups were more likely to be sampled in a survey. So if you know the probability that someone's going to be in the survey, you use the inverse probability weights so that they're representative of the population they come from. In this case, I'm going to use the probability of being in some group of grandparent education based on the control variables to find inverse probability weights. When you use those, you have groups of grandparent education that have the same distribution of parents' education or whatever the control variable is. So the weights, when I constructed these weights, I made sure that all of the means of these variables are within 2% of a standard deviation of the group they're being compared to. Okay, so in both approaches, I'm trying to explain the multi-generational inequality by comparing the high and the low group to the middle grandparent education group. The main advantage of this is it allows you to separate the advantage of coming from a really highly educated family background from the disadvantage of coming from a less educated background. Okay. Any questions about, yeah?
So you have mom reports, and then mom reports with her mom, and then separate child reports at age 14, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So do you need to account for anything in terms of that there's two related reporters, like in terms of multi-level model, or that's not relevant, or?
So the different variables have different reporters. So it's a lot of the, like the achievement tests are just assessments of kids. The self-perception stuff is self-reports of kids. Delinquency and drug use are reports of kids. Behavior problems are reports of moms. So I do adjust for clustering within families to make sure the standard errors are appropriate. I don't use a multi-level model to separate the effects of different reporters, but I hope that having like kid reports of their own delinquency and parent reports of their behavior
They're all the
problems.
same regression analysis?
Yeah.
I see. And then is there an advantage to doing all the things that you just said in regression versus in SEM, or?
Good question. So I haven't done this model in an SEM yet.
Line or blow up?
Yeah, it will. So the main advantage of SEM is to better deal with measurement error. I could treat all the constructs as latent variables and get an idea of how well I'm measuring them and account for measurement error. The problem with SEM is you have to make strong assumptions about every possible effect in the model, and like you said, it would blow up because this is too complicated. But in this analysis, those complications aren't a big deal, and it allows me to have a more flexible conceptual model. So I don't have to make as many assumptions about, for example, whether parents' family upbringing has a direct effect on their education. Okay, so the overall gaps without controlling for anything, this is just average highest grade completed for the child across the 3 levels of grandparents' education. So for the low group, the average is 13, which is roughly a year of college. The middle group, it's a shade under 14, so less than 2 years of college. The high group, it's 15. If we look at specific degrees, there's a gradient across levels of grandparent education for all of these outcomes, which is expected. So across the 3 grandparental education groups, the probability of getting a high school diploma goes up over a little more than 10 percentage points. The gaps are a little wider, especially between the highest grandparents' education group and the middle. When you look at attending college, when you look at earning a bachelor's degree, there's a pretty substantial gap and a pretty substantial advantage for those who had grandparents who had a college degree. So that's what I'm trying to explain. The simplest way to show this is just to add the percent to this graph. I'll show you a different way to show the results next. But the percent of the gaps that are explained by each construct when we follow the order in the forward sequence. So only 3% is due to differences in race, nativity, region, etc., back in the parents' upbringing or grandparents' generation. So most of it is some mechanisms of transmission of education, like irrespective of race and nativity. 28% is explained in this first or second step, where we account for the mother's upbringing when they were young. And that's despite this probably being pretty poorly measured. That was the one that I was most worried about. 32%, after accounting for that, the next 32% explained by the mother's skills when they were young. 12% by mother's educational aspirations and expectations. And then 17% explained by the parents' education. That adds up to 89% of the total multi-generational educational inequality being explained by the direct links between grandparents' education and parents' attributes when they were young. 10% is unexplained. So remember these three, when we looked at when I want to explain the direct effects, I said I expected them to operate through a relationship from grandparents' education to children's upbringing, skills, or educational orientations, and only 1% is explained by that. So I'll come back to that, but it suggests that any direct effect of grandparents' education on kids' education is pretty minimal. So this 10%, we could say it's attributable to some direct effect, but based on this, I would be really skeptical about saying that it's actually a direct effect. It's probably a bunch of stuff that I haven't been able to measure in these data, like father's attributes when they were growing up, or some of the variables you mentioned, like trauma, more specific measures of family processes when the parents were growing up.
What's a negative thing in that context?
So this means after we've already accounted for the disparities and all of this stuff, the less advantaged groups their children actually have a better family upbringing than the more advantaged groups. So if you were to equalize that after you've accounted for this, you would actually increase inequality. And I've done some other analyses. I think that's related to the home environment, like cognitive stimulation and emotional support measures. So once you account for parents' background, a lot of the disparities, less advantaged children actually have more favorable home environments once you've accounted for the other social background factors. This graph is the same analysis. It shows you the average. And I should have said this was the reweighting analysis. And I'm looking at the gap between the highest and lowest groups, and I'm looking at the highest grade of school completed. This is the same analysis, except I'm comparing both methods. This is average highest grade of school completed across each step in the analysis. You can see, so this is the high group. The middle group is the reference, so it doesn't change, and then the low group at the bottom. And basically, there's not much difference between the two methods in this case. They tell the same story about multi-generational inequality. The other thing you can see is, so the explained inequality are the steps where you see these gaps decrease, and all of that is explained by mostly it's explained by the parents' family background, skills, orientations, and education. So the inequality that we explained is related to grandparents' influence on parents. Okay, so the reverse decomposition, so that analysis tells us where the inequality first emerges. The reverse analysis tells us what does it eventually operate through. So the first step here are children's orientations, their aspirations and expectations, and then children's skills, and then their family upbringing. Those are about equally consequential and account for 55% of inequality. Another 29% is some direct relationship to education in the parents' generation. And then beyond that, there's only 8% linked to earlier attributes of parents, and we have the same 10% that's not explained. So basically, we showed that most inequality emerges through grandparents' influence on parents when they're young, but most inequality operates through children's attributes and experiences, which isn't surprising. This is the showing you that the results for this analysis are basically the same with the two methods. And it also shows you that most of the inequality that is explained operates through children's attributes. And then this additional step that explains inequality is parents' education. I will say that, so when I separated the effect of grandparent co-residence, it didn't have much of an impact, but I don't have any data on the nature of, like, is it a sick grandparent that's being cared for? Is it a grandparent who has more of like a surrogate parent role? Ideally, I would have measured aspects of the grandparent-child relationship a lot better. So this is only accounting for differences in the level of grandparent co-residence across groups. So I think that's one of the areas that would benefit from a lot of research in the future is getting a better handle on grandparent-child relationships. There's some of that, but not really in this stratification literature. So that was just years of school. These are separate graphs showing the results for specific outcomes. So probability of getting a high school diploma. I'm just going to show that forward sequence for these. Here there are some differences across the methods. So if you use a regression analysis, it looks like you explain a lot more inequality. You explain basically all of it with a regression, but using the reweighting method, which makes fewer assumptions, you don't explain near as much. So this might be a problem with the regression approach. It's hard to say exactly why there are those differences, but the method does matter here. But again, the story is basically the same. So the inequality in high school completion that exists is explained by grandparents' earlier influences on parents. And there isn't much explained by the link between grandparents' education and kids' attributes. This is college attendance. The results are basically identical to what I just showed you for high school completion. So there are differences in the methods. The story is the same, though. Most of the inequality that you explain operates through parents. And most of what's not explained is due to an advantage of having a highly educated grandparent. We do pretty much explain the inequality between having a less educated grandparent and the middle group. It's some advantage that's not explained for the high group. And that was somewhat true for high school completion. Okay, and this is bachelor's degree attainment. Here the methods don't matter as much. You see, again, we explain a lot of the multi-generational inequality with measures of the attributes of the parents. And there's still this unexplained gap. I think it's about 5 percentage points for those who have a highly educated grandparent compared to everyone else. But we explained the disadvantage of the low group. Are there any questions about this before I kind of summarize what I think is happening here? Okay, so the story that I think this tells is that multi-generational inequality emerges through grandparents' influence on parents when they're young, especially the family upbringing of the parents and their skill development, cognitive and non-cognitive skill development. It ultimately operates through children's attributes. And there is a link to parental education as well. but especially children's upbringing and skills and educational orientations. So this suggests that contemporary educational inequality in the U.S. is largely driven by a sequence of parent-to-child intergenerational transmissions. Grandparents influence parents when they're young. Parents convert those influences into attainment. Parents influence their children when they're young, and children convert those influences into their own attainment. And this is the basic two-generation stratification approach that people have trying to test. So in these analyses, there was unexplained multi-generational inequality, but I think based on the evidence, it's a stretch to attribute it to direct effects because we would have expected it to operate through kids' skills and educational aspirations and upbringing. And the unexplained portion, which I don't have a good explanation for, seems to be driven by the advantage of having a highly educated grandparent. It's not a disadvantage of having less educated grandparents. So I think there's three broad problems with this analysis. The first thing is there's reasons to suspect that I have underestimated the importance of grandparents' status on kids' backgrounds. The main one is that I've looked at education, but there are a lot of different aspects of socioeconomic status that might have an influence on kids' life chances as well. And I think what I would really want is wealth, because that's the easiest thing it's the type of resource that can persist over generations and have the biggest impact. So I don't have measures of grandparents' wealth, but that's probably pretty important. I know that my college was partially paid for because my grandmother set aside money for my college because I don't think she trusted her children to invest appropriately. So I would expect that grandparents' wealth and their investment strategies do matter, but I don't know how much. So to the extent that any of those things are uncorrelated with grandparents' education, I'm not capturing any of that here. Another point is even if there aren't these big direct multi-generational effects at the population level, there's no doubt that grandparents are going to be more important for some groups than others. So the more involved parents are in child rearing and financial support for kids, things like that, the more they're going to matter because they would take on the importance that this analysis attributes to parents. So it would be worth looking at specific subgroups as well. And then even the meager, I guess a different perspective is even the meager direct effects that I found might be overestimated because I haven't been able to measure attributes of father's background. I just have their education and things that came after that. I don't have their skills or values or upbringing. And both of these methods are useful, but they're probably imperfect for accounting for the importance of all these constructs. So that's the story. Like I said, I'm looking forward to questions and feedback to get this thing ready to send out and hopefully get it published eventually.
I was going to say, just thinking about how this sort of overlaps with historical context, I wonder if you might be able to find a variable for parental or grandparental military service, because I think the GI Bill in a lot of cases might have been something that could have switched tracks for families from the previous generation having fairly low attainment and the next generation getting a bump.
That's a great idea. I probably can get that. So one of the problems with this research is because you need 3 generations and the data are just now available, most of it looks at the same cohorts, but because there's differences in ages that the grandparents and parents had their kids, I could definitely get some variation in that, and even if I have variation in military service, that would be helpful. Yeah, I'll look into that. It's a good idea.
So first of all, thank you. This is really interesting. As someone who studies grandparent-grandchild relationships, I sort of appreciated the plug in the end. It's like we need to know what's actually happening between grandparents and grandchildren. But I do wonder, in this data set, do you have any information about health, parent, child, or grandparent?
I don't have much on grandparents. I would have a lot on the kids. And probably I would have stuff on the parents as they've aged and not when they were younger. But yeah, not much on parents.
So I'm wondering if one piece of that unexplained gap is actually the grandparents who have higher educational attainment may have better, first of all, be in better health, and secondly, then require less financial or other kinds of assistance from their children. And so therefore, those are resources, time and financial resources that can be devoted towards the youngest generation's education.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. That helps me explain what I can explain. I'll go back and look. I don't think I have good measures of the grandparents' health, but it does make sense that if the highly educated grandparents are like less of like you don't have to trade off investments in the grandparents' health and the children, that probably makes a big difference. Sure.
Do you have any information, I haven't used this data set specifically, about census tracts? So you could look historically at educational attainment within the census tract to get more at, like you control it for things like race or urbanicity, but to get at like specifically where those people are located in terms of educational attainment of their communities. Because I'm wondering about that really small percent and the implications that has for policy, since it was really focused on the parent or familial relationships rather than some of the social demographic factors that we know are associated with lack of access to education.
Yeah, so I could probably, if I were to do that, I would need restricted access. So I think they do provide that if you get restricted access data. I haven't tried that yet. But so there is evidence of an increase in income segregation, and it's concentrated among wealthy people. So wealthier people are increasingly living more isolated neighborhoods. And that might also relate to grandparents' wealth. So the wealthier grandparents, maybe you can live in these better neighborhoods, and that might have an impact on these outcomes. That's a good idea.
I also wonder if something like the person-centered approach, like a linked class analysis, would make sense. Because like you're doing the regressions, right? These very complicated regressions. But it might be that there's just these very small groups that are emerging, and so like maybe you put in things like race, if certain folks are, doing more with their grandchildren, and possibly class. And maybe some of that might then result in different classes that are then predicting differential impacts of education. So I can give you like an anecdotal example. Has anyone read Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance? Anyone? J.D.? It's really thought-provoking in many ways. So very briefly, and I'm not giving away any spoilers. So, but it's on the bestseller list, so you should check it out now. Reserve it in the library. There's like 500 people ahead of you. So, but it's really interesting. So his story is that he grew up in the Rust Belt. He's white, and his mom had all these mental health issues. So, on average, he should have been like a grade school dropout, high school dropout. But he ended up going to Ohio State, did really well, went to the military, so the GI Bill was developed there. And then he went to Yale Law School, and now he works for a company in San Francisco that's founded by Peter Thiel, who's one of the PayPal guys. So it's an extraordinary story, right? And the book is dedicated to his grandparents, because he said without his grandparents, he would never have survived education, he would have been nothing. So, there's really something to be said about the influence that grandparents can have, but he's a really select group there. So maybe there's something about class or race or other things that might, small ways that differentially explain educational outcomes. There might be something there that the regression is masking.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So, and actually that book it's in my Amazon shopping cart, but I haven't clicked it. Okay, well, I'll click the button today. Yeah, so that helps me in terms of, like, I do suspect there's variation across subgroups, and I could do that sort of analysis to figure out what are the subgroups that actually differ. Yeah.
How many grandmothers actually had college attainment? I might have missed that in the
Oh.
about but just thinking historically in terms of like ladies, the women grandmothers in this cohort may have not had as much access to
Well, even mothers. If the teens, I mean, if the kids were 22 and 79, if the parents.
Let's see, did I include that in this table? I have grandparents, I have parents. I think I took that out. So, I do have the number of grandparents overall. It was much less than had some college or no college. But, so I do remember in the high group, it's more driven by fathers who had a college degree than mothers. It wasn't a huge difference, but yeah, I think at the lower levels it was more driven by the grandmother's education. Yeah, but I can't remember the exact number. There's too many slides up here. So 1,300 out of about 11,000, a little more than 10% had some maternal grandparent with a college degree, but I think it was disproportionately grandfathers.
Yeah, just building on Melissa's point that, yeah, if you swapped it out to a family level analysis, so this is a given family over time, the question could become, is that family going up or down in education? And they might go from almost nothing to the kids finally getting grade 12. That's still an improvement. Versus who's the family who had, university degree and the grandparent, and then by the time we got the kids, they're dropping out of high school. And switching the focus to the family over time would just change up the kind of information incredibly. Yeah.
That's a good idea. So I've been interested in, most research looks at upward mobility, but what's going on with the kids from advantaged backgrounds who drop out of high school or don't go to college? So yeah, a family sort of trajectory type of analysis, I could look at both.
But when you say multi-generational inequality, are you meaning, what do you mean by that? I guess that's what I'm confused about.
So,
does it mean that I'm not like my grandparent? Or I am very much like my grandparent only had a bachelor's degree, so I had a bachelor's degree. Is that that's equality, right? Is that
okay. So sorry, I took that for granted because I'm kind of just reading these studies all the time. But so inequality refers to it. Actually, you can think of it as the lack of mobility across generations. So the more people on average are like their grandparents, the more intergenerational or multi-generational inequality there is, because that indicates that status is being transmitted across generations. So it means that disparities across kids' outcomes are related to their grandparents. So the more you're like your grandparent, the more on average people are, the more multi-generational inequality is. Yeah. But you could also just change the wording and say that there's a higher degree of multi-generational similarity or transmission. Yeah.
I was thinking about race as well in a little bit of a different way, and I have no idea how this fits in, but because I come from the world of early childhood, so birth to 5, there's a lot of, a growing body of research about preschool expulsions. And we're talking now about the preschool to prison pipeline rather than the school to prison pipeline. And so and the evidence points to a fact that black children are expelled at much higher rates than their white peers, especially proportional to their percentages that they are attending preschool. So I don't know, I guess I was just thinking about that. It might relate to the downward mobility piece a little bit too in a way, and I don't know how it fits in, but it seems to me that it might be relevant.
Yeah, so unfortunately the way I've done this is I basically hold race constant across these groups from the very beginning, and so I don't get into any of the ways that racial inequality would contribute to this. And the other aspect that you brought up is I don't have good measures of what's happening in school. So most of these, like, you have to make trade-offs when you're choosing data. This data set is really good for data on families, but it doesn't have good information on schools. The data that has really good information on schools doesn't have as comprehensive of information on families. For racial inequality, the evidence is that there is something that happens in schools that exacerbates and contributes to racial inequality. For socioeconomic inequality, the evidence comes down more in terms of family, things that happen before school and outside of school. But yeah, for racial inequality, the things that happen in school and experiences and that affects how you feel about education. And if you expect to be discriminated against, you're less likely to invest in education, things like that.
And I imagine it might be, well, because surely a sample of this age wouldn't account for, preschool experience probably, but maybe it would be reflected in completion of high school or completion of college and things like that.
Yeah. I actually do have some measures of like whether they were in a preschool or Head Start, but I don't have measures of the quality. Like, there's a lot of variation in the quality of those types of programs. If you are interested in the paper, I'm happy to share it. Or if you have any other questions, feel free to email me.
Thank you.